we are back for Overanalyzing House of the Dragon, the deep dive into House of the Dragon source material, describing how Rhaenyra's Blacks came to face off against Aegon's Greens. After years and years of preventing Rhaenyra and the Velaryon faction from sitting the Iron Throne, powers now seem intent on keeping Daemon, and now Rhaenyra, from ascending. Rumors and gossip keep plaguing Rhaenyra, but she remains heir, and now she has come of age. And so let's continue. Of the aftermath, these things are certain. Daemon Targaryen returned to the Stepstones and resumed his struggle for those barren, storm-swept rocks. Grand Maester Runketer and Sir Harold Westerling both died in 112 AC. Sir Criston Cole was named the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard in Sir Harold's place, and the Archmaesters of the Citadel sent Maester Mellos to the Red Keep to take up the Grand Maester's chain and duties. Elsewise, King's Landing returned to its customary tranquility for the best part of 2 years. Until 113 AC, when Princess Rhaenyra turned 16, took possession of Dragonstone as her own seat, and married. And so in this paragraph we see that the events after Daemon and Viserys' second quarrel do not match the accounts of the feud by Septon Eustace or Mushroom. There is simply too small of a bang for such a supposedly large bomb. As we know, Daemon and Viserys eventually reconcile in 5 years or so, something that wouldn't have occurred if Daemon took Rhaenyra's maidenhead or was giving her sex lessons. And on top of this, we see here that Daemon is able to return to his war in the Stepstones, which, as we know, is financed by Viserys. If there were a serious transgression committed by Daemon, Viserys' funding would have likely ended. Something we do not see. You simply don't keep sending money to someone who molested your 14-year-old daughter. In fact, funding to Daemon likely increased during this period as Daemon is able to continue his war for another 4 years against not just the Triarchy, but also Dorne, which entered the war in 110. Although not as exciting, it's likely Daemon simply asked for Rhaenyra's hand in marriage. We also see the rise of Sir Criston Cole to Lord Commander, which is something that would not have occurred if he spurned Rhaenyra, as Mushroom claimed, or had been discovered as Rhaenyra's lover, a rumor Aerys Oakheart thinks about. So at least at this point in time, it's rather clear that there was no romance between Rhaenyra and Criston Cole, or if there were, it remained a secret. Now the other big event that happens in the years after Viserys and Daemon's second quarrel is the death of Runketer and his replacement with Grand Maester Mellos. And this is actually a rather big change. Runketer, for the most part, was a rather silent character who made few waves in his time as Grand Maester. If he were part of an Old Town conspiracy, he was subtle about it. The only real move of note in his 11-year career was to recommend that Viserys marry the too young Laenor Velaryon, which resulted in Viserys marrying Alicent. Either Runketer was out of the loop on wanting a Hightower marriage for Viserys, or he was very crafty, knowing that Viserys would reject Laena and want to marry Alicent instead. Grand Maester Mellos, however, is certainly not as subtle, and we'll see more of his antics going along. Also in this paragraph, there's a few more things that show Gyldain's bias. The Stepstones are called barren, storm-swept rocks, making it sound like Daemon's kingdom is nothing and that his fight is pointless. Yet we know this to be untrue, as the Stepstones have already been established as strategically important as a gateway to the Narrow Sea, but also, at least in the modern story, the Stepstones are a significant trading area where Victarion takes on fresh water, skins, and grain. Additionally, the islands are considered a prize, a place of value that Euron promises the Ironborn, and a place that Salador Sand's men miss. The other odd thing in this paragraph is that Gyldain says that King's Landing returned to tranquility once Daemon Targaryen leaves, yet Gyldain already described King's Landing as a place of tension where Greens and Blacks feuded and rumors were all about. Long before any man had reason to doubt her innocence, the question of selecting a suitable consort for Rhaenyra had been a concern to King Viserys and his council. Great lords and dashing knights fluttered around her like moths around a flame, vying for her favor. When Rhaenyra visited the Trident in 112, the sons of Lord Bracken and Lord Blackwood fought a duel over her, and a younger son of House Frey made so bold as to ask openly for her hand. Fool Frey, he was called thereafter. In the west, Sir Jason Lannister and his twin, Sir Tyland, vied for her during a feast at Casterly Rock. The sons of Lord Tully of River Run, Lord Tyrell of Highgarden, Lord Oakheart of Old Oak, and Lord Tarley of Hornhill paid court to the princess, as did the Hand's eldest son, Sir Harwin Strong. Breakbones, as he was called, was heir to Harrenhal, and said to be the strongest man in the Seven Kingdoms. Viserys even talked of wedding Rhaenyra to the Prince of Dorne, as a way of bringing the Dornish into the realm. And so next we hear that King Viserys and the Small Council had been talking about a husband for Rhaenyra, and apparently they had been discussing this for a long time, as, according to Gildane, they were doing it long before the sex rumors about Rhaenyra appeared, and those sex rumors were being spread rather early, around 109 or 110, when Rhaenyra was 12 or 13 years old. On a side note, it's rather telling that the rumors about Rhaenyra are now reasons to doubt her innocence, despite Gildane straight up saying that the sources were dubious. So this whole discussion on who Rhaenyra should wed lasted 3 or 4 years. Now it's rather difficult to determine why the discussion took so long. Laenor Velaryon, when it comes down to it, is an utterly obvious choice for Rhaenyra's husband. He's around the same age, there's a clear political benefit for Viserys to join with the Velaryons, one of the richest and most powerful houses in Westeros, and appease Rhaenys, the queen who never was, at the same time. There's the Targaryen tradition of marrying close kin, and Laenor is a dragon rider whose mother is also a dragon rider and whose sister rides the biggest dragon in the world. It's really a no-brainer, yet it weirdly took a long time to get to this point. Now, unfortunately, there is no clear reason in the text for why people were searching for a match for Rhaenyra as early as 12 or 13 for her. One event that happened around that time was Otto being dropped his hand for pushing the switching of heirs. So perhaps the council knew that the topic of switching heirs was off limits with Viserys, and scheming about Rhaenyra's marriage was their new avenue. Or perhaps marriage discussions simply began earlier when Aegon was born in 107 and a marriage of Rhaenyra to Aegon was seen as an option. We simply don't know. The other idea is that discussions of marrying Rhaenyra began when Dorne entered the War in the Stepstones in 110. We know that Viserys contemplated marrying Rhaenyra to the Prince of Dorne in an attempt to bring Dorne into the realm. The Seven Kingdoms would be united, and the War in the Stepstones would likely be won. And really, other than the Prince of Dorne, there aren't many candidates for marriage that are as impressive as Laenor Velaryon. It could be that the brokering with Dorne took years and fell apart, though again, there is nothing in the text about this. The larger mystery is actually the later date of 113, or 114 rather, when Rhaenyra gets married. The text is a bit confusing, having just said that Rhaenyra married at 16 in the year 113, but later it very clearly says she married at 17 in the year 114. Suddenly, Viserys and the Small Council felt it rather imperative that Rhaenyra marry. The thing is, nothing much happened of note politically or otherwise in those years. At least nothing we hear of. 16 is often the traditional age for women to be wed, but some girls are married before and some after, and in fact Rhaenyra is married at 17. Maybe Corlys was looking for Laenor to marry someone else and the crown got scared. Maybe brokering with Dorne completely broke down. Whatever the reason, it had nothing to do with Daemon, as those events happened years earlier. Now, we do hear about Rhaenyra traveling the kingdom, and various men giving her attention, though we really don't know if these trips were for the purpose of finding a husband. Rhaenyra was being groomed to rule, and these trips may have been political in nature. In fact, if one pays close attention to the wording, we see that except for Frey and Viserys wanting to marry Rhaenyra to the Prince of Dorne, there is no mention of marriage with any of these men. A Bracken and a Blackwood fought a duel over Rhaenyra. It doesn't actually say it was for her hand, and the Lannisters vied for her, but it doesn't actually say for marriage, and men paid court to her. That is, they gave her attention. Again, no mention of marriage. Oh, Gildane is implying it, and the reader assumes romantic interest because Rhaenyra is a woman and these are men, but outside of that, there's actually little evidence. In fact, it's much more likely that these visits were political and not for marriage, as quite a few of these characters pop up later. The Bracken and Blackwoods who fight a duel are Aemys Bracken, an eventual Green supporter, and Samuel Blackwood, an eventual Black supporter, who face off again during the Dance of the Dragons. The Frey is Forrest Frey, who, despite being a younger son here, and thus a fool for thinking he has the station to ask for Rhaenyra's hand, does in fact become Lord of the Crossing and a Black supporter. Tywin Lannister eventually joins the Small Council and is a major Green supporter, and Jason Lannister, his brother, is the Lord of Casterly Rock. also a Green supporter during the dance. The Tully son is likely the father of Elmo Tully, who becomes a Black supporter despite the grandfather, Grover Tully, being a Green supporter. Then we hear about some nameless Tyrell's son who apparently dies, as later the Lord of Highgarden is an infant during the dance and House Tyrell stays neutral. The Oakhart's son is an eventual Black supporter. Alan Tarley is an eventual Black supporter. Harwin Strong, the heir to Harrenhal, becomes Rhaenyra's sworn shield and a Black supporter. And all of these men becoming Black supporters is not insignificant. Stepping back from all of this, if we go back to the Council of 101, that was hosted by the Strongs at Harrenhal, where Lannister and Tyrell brought their armies in support of Viserys over Rhaenys and Laenor. At the council, the Westermen, Rivermen, and Reachers were rather united in their opposition to female rule and the Velaryon faction. And now, a little over a decade later, we see the winds shifting, and by the time of the dance, Rhaenyra pulls off an incredible feat. Despite Grover Tully wanting to support the Greens, the Riverlords largely break Black, including Tully's own grandson. And in the Reach, Tyrell moves into the neutral camp and half of the Reach goes Black despite the Green faction being synonymous with the Hightower faction. This traveling of the kingdom by Rhaenyra that is presented as a marriage tour was most likely an effort to ensure fealty and rally military support, and not simply a groom shopping trip. Queen Alicent had her own candidate, her eldest son, Prince Aegon, Rhaenyra's half-brother. But Aegon was a boy, the princess 10 years his elder. Moreover, the two half-siblings had never gotten on well. All the more reason to bind them together in marriage, the queen argued. Viserys did not agree. The boy is Alicent's own blood, he told Lord Strong. She wants him on the throne. So next we get a short paragraph that reveals quite a bit politically. Alicent wants Rhaenyra to marry Aegon, her half-brother, though Viserys rejects the idea, claiming the two don't get along, only to later say that Alicent wants Aegon on the throne. So let's start out with Alicent's motivation here. Now on first read, it may seem like a simple, self-interested way to make Aegon a sort of co-ruler with Rhaenyra and put Alicent's eventual grandchildren on the throne. This event could also conceivably be put forward as a way to show that there is no Old Town conspiracy against Rhaenyra and her bloodline, as she and Aegon's children would eventually be the rulers. Except we should remember that Rhaenyra is 10 years older than Aegon. Aegon is a child, and he would not be consummating his marriage until at least age 12, if not older. And it's not even guaranteed that he's fertile at that point. So marriage to Aegon puts off a 16 or 17-year-old Rhaenyra having sex and having children for 5 or 6 years, until she's at least 22, possibly longer. And in that period, the Green faction would have time to work. As we know, rumors have already been around that Rhaenyra has been having sex with Criston Cole and Daemon Targaryen. They would have another 5 or 6 years for something to land, or for Rhaenyra to actually screw up and have extramarital sex. This is a very similar situation to A Feast for Crows, when Marjorie is married to Tommen, a boy 8 years her junior, and must wait years to consummate. And so Cersei tries to have Osney Kettleblack seduce her and have her commit adultery. If Viserys is convinced that Rhaenyra has committed adultery, switching his heir to Aegon becomes rather easy. Now, amazingly, it actually seems like Viserys is on to Alicent in this paragraph. Even though Alicent is only requesting that Aegon become king consort, Viserys sees through this. He gives an excuse to Alicent that he doesn't think the two would get along, while giving his real reason to Lyonel Strong. Viserys' excuse is laughably weak, by the way, as getting along with someone who is 6 years old hardly tells you about their personality when they're an adult. Not to mention, later on, Viserys has no regard for Rhaenyra's happiness in her marriage. The true reason for the denial is given to Lyonel Strong. Alicent wants Aegon on the throne. And it's rather interesting that Viserys is not completely oblivious here. Otto and Alicent pushed for the heir to be switched for years, and now Viserys questions his own wife's motivations. He knows that somehow the marriage would weaken Rhaenyra's position. Now, the reason being reported by Lyonel Strong is also interesting. Lyonel, despite being a clear Otto Hightower plant with connections to Old Town, does pretty much nothing of note in his tenure as Hand. He's part of the small council and supposedly is ruling the kingdom, but we get nothing from him specifically. The one action that is attributed to him by Mushroom, calling for Daemon's execution, is absolutely a lie. But here we find out that a private conversation between Viserys and Lyonel, a sensitive one at that, where the king admits that he does not trust his own wife, is clearly being divulged to someone, likely the Citadel. Lionel is absolutely a schemer. He is just not very active as far as we know, or is hidden behind the term the Small Council. The best choice, King and Small Council finally agreed, would be Rhaenyra's cousin Laenor Velaryon. Though the Great Council of 101 had ruled against his claim, the Velaryon boy remained a grandson of Prince Aemon Targaryen of hallowed memory, a great-grandson of the old king himself. Such a match would unite and strengthen the royal bloodline, and regain the Iron Throne the friendship of the Sea Snake with his powerful fleet. One objection was raised. Laenor Velaryon was now 19 years of age, yet had never shown any interest in women. Instead, he surrounded himself with handsome squires of his own age, and was said to prefer their company. But Grand Maester Mellos dismissed this concern out of hand. "What of it?" he said. "I do not like the taste of fish, but when fish is served, I eat it." Thus was the match decided. And so, eventually the Small Council comes to the conclusion that Laenor Velaryon is the best match for Rhaenyra, which, as I said before, was overwhelmingly obvious, with this paragraph mentioning a number of the reasons that we've already gone over. Though, curiously, there is no mention of Laenor's dragon, nor Rhaenys and Laena's, which is frankly ridiculous. Imagine someone speaking of the benefits of marrying Daenerys Targaryen and not bringing up her 3 dragons. Corlys's fleet gets a shout-out, but not Seasmoke, Meleys, or Vhagar. And then we get the rub of the marriage. Rumor has it, Laenor is gay. But Mellos dismisses the concern with a rather blunt fish vagina analogy. Now, I will say, there is some question to whether Laenor is actually gay. He does go on to perhaps father 5 children, where excuses must be made on how they aren't really his. Laenor's 3 trueborn children are rumored to be Harwin Strong's, despite Harwin having a broken collarbone during the conception of the first one, and his father Corlys Velaryon is rumored to have fathered the other 2, despite having a war to fight in the Stepstones at the time. Mere rumors are what point most people to Laenor being gay, but rumors also slander Laenor by repeatedly calling him a pedophile, despite the fact that he is also described as only hanging out with squires his own age. Now, the strongest evidence that Laenor is actually gay comes not from rumors, but from the fact that the Small Council, namely Grand Maester Mellos, a clear Green supporter, wanted the match. Rhaenyra being married to a gay man with no romantic interest in her certainly increases the odds that she will have extramarital sex to fulfill human romantic needs. And in fact, Mellos himself spreads rumors that Rhaenyra was unfaithful in her marriage, despite he himself being influential in placing Rhaenyra in that very marriage. It is the same playbook that Otto and Alicent have been doing for years. Spread rumors about Rhaenyra's sex life to try to get the heir switched to Aegon. But related to all of this, we should point out that, of course, Laenor might be bisexual, and even if he were gay, he is completely capable of producing offspring with Rhaenyra. King and Council had neglected to consult the princess, however, and Rhaenyra proved to be very much her father's daughter, with her own notions about whom she wished to wed. The princess knew much and more about Laenor Velaryon, and had no wish to be his bride. "My half-brothers would be more to his taste," she told the king. The princess always took care to refer to Queen Alicent's sons as half-brothers, never as brothers. And though his grace reasoned with her, pleaded with her, shouted at her, and called her an ungrateful daughter, no words of his could budge her. Until the king brought up the question of succession. What a king had done, a king could undo, Viserys pointed out. She would wed as he commanded, or he would make her half-brother Aegon his heir in place of her. At this, the princess's will gave way. Septon Eustace says she fell at her father's knees and begged for forgiveness, Mushroom that she spat in her father's face, but both agree that in the end, she consented to be married. So here we find out that Rhaenyra does not want to marry Laenor, as she has also heard rumors that he is gay, and even seems to believe that he's a pedophile, as she thinks 7-year-old Aegon and 4-year-old Aemond would be more to his tastes. If this quote is accurate, Rhaenyra is being quite a jerk by conflating homosexuality and pedophilia, an all-too-common belief. That said, such a quote would also contradict some later reports of Rhaenyra's behavior, as Mushroom claims that Rhaenyra was turned on by homosexuality. And so we have a discrepancy. Either Rhaenyra is a sexual prude, seeing homosexuality as devious and wrongly correlating it with other devious sexual behavior like pedophilia, or she is sexually adventurous, getting turned on by homosexual sex. Of course, if gay men turned her on, she wouldn't have had a problem with her marriage. It all doesn't really square. For the entire story so far, the Greens have been trying to portray Rhaenyra as sexually open or as a sexual deviant, having extramarital sex, sleeping with her uncle, getting sex lessons, filleting dwarfs. But here Rhaenyra is shown as sexually prudish and intolerant. Now, the paragraph also mentions that Rhaenyra had her own notion of who she should marry. The implication is, of course, that she wants to marry Daemon, which fits. He is the only other dragon rider of marrying age. There are reports that she wanted to marry him years ago, and most importantly, when given the freedom to marry, she actually does marry Daemon. Now, the other interesting thing about this paragraph is the urgency of Rhaenyra and Laenor getting married. She is apparently quite against it, but Viserys thinks it's so necessary that he threatens to switch his heir. Which is odd, as Viserys was open to Rhaenyra marrying the Prince of Dorne. He was open to political situations that didn't involve him being linked with the Velaryons. Now, we are not sure what exactly is going on politically here, but it is likely that it has something to do with the War in the Stepstones. He was open to Rhaenyra marrying the Prince of Dorne and losing out on those 3 Velaryon dragons and the Velaryon fleet. But then, no, things change, and it's critical that Rhaenyra marry Laenor. It's really anyone's guess as to the specific details between the Crown, the Velaryons, Braavos, Dorne, and the Triarchy. Now there is one last tiny thing in this paragraph that's a bit interesting. Gildain mentions that Rhaenyra always called Aegon and Aemond her half-brothers. This is a little reference to Jon Snow. Sansa was always careful to call Jon her half-brother, correcting others, and Jon himself was also very careful to tell people that he was the half-brother to Robb, also correcting others. It's also likely a little bit of a joke about George R. R. Martin's own retcon. In the Ice and Fire series, Rhaenyra and Aegon are actually never described as half-siblings, and are simply called brother and sister. In fact, in the original Game of Thrones appendix, they are said to only be a year apart, implying that they were full-blood siblings. But with the release of Princess and the Queen, the continuity was changed, and they were made into half-siblings. And this is a good place to stop. We will continue on with more slanderous sex rumors about Rhaenyra next time in part 15. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.